If you like this podcast, then you're going to love The Week magazine and its daily digital digests. And now is the ideal time to try it out. With analysis and opinion from across the political spectrum, stay informed this summer with The Week. Enjoy 6 weeks free, then save an extra 30% on a print and digital subscription when you enter the offer code SUMMER24 at theweek.com/offer. Start your free trial today at theweek.com/offer with the code SUMMER24. It's the week ending Friday the 5th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Labour winning their first general election for 19 years, Joe Biden insisting to Democrats he will be their candidate despite a stumbling performance in the CNN debate, and Andy Murray pulling out of the Wimbledon's men's singles. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Harriet Marsden. Then let's spin the globe down under and join Arion McNicoll from History Podcast Today in History with the Retrospectors, and then spin it again to Hong Kong, where we find refugee podcaster turned lecturer Abdulwahab Tahhan. This is all very Eurovision. Arion, you've been writing a daily election newsletter over the last 6 weeks for us Brits. Is there a part of you that's glad it's all over?
I am. There's a large part of me that's glad it's all over, but I sort of feel both fatigued by it in the way that you all are surely fatigued by it, but also like I haven't really gone through it. I haven't lived there. I've been like doing it from half a world away, so it does feel like I'm a little bit of an imposter on this one, but yes.
Have you bookmarked some videos of Ed Davey jumping out of things just to cheer you up on future afternoons?
Really, that was the thing that kept me going most, and there was a Ladbrokes bet you could take about him firing himself out of a cannon before election day. And in a year when like politicians placing bets on themselves doing political acts became a whole hot topic, I was like, is this one that's going to like blow up literally and metaphorically in the Lib Dems' faces?
Okay, well, we're not here to talk about the election, as we have not been for the last 6 weeks, and we're not breaking our record now. Abdul, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why didn't the police arrive early to beat the crowd?
Toplumda yabancı düşmanlığını.
Nothing can be achieved by fueling xenophobia and hatred of refugees. One of the reasons for the regrettable events caused by a small group in Kayseri on Sunday is the poisonous rhetoric of the opposition. No matter who they are, vandalism and setting streets and houses on fire is unacceptable.
Okay, so that's President Erdogan of Turkey in a press conference on Wednesday. What was he reacting to, Abdul?
Well, he's reacting to the latest problems in Kayseri. So the city of Kayseri in central Turkey is facing significant unrest following a series of attacks on Syrian refugees and their properties. The violence was triggered by a viral video falsely accusing a Syrian guy molesting a 7-year-old Turkish girl in a local market. It was later clarified that both the accused and the child was Syrian, actually, and the accused has a mental disorder. Despite this, the violence continued, fueled by misinformation and exploited by political figures to incite anti-refugee sentiments. So a lot of Turkish nationals attacked Syrian refugees' properties in Kayseri, flipped their cars, burned their shops, and attacked them in lots of different places.
And Turkey is home to over 3 million refugees, like you, who fled Syria during its more than decade-long civil war. How common are these sorts of attacks on Syrians in Turkey?
Well, the official number stands now at 3.4, and that's just the official number, not to include the unofficial number, which we believe that it's around 4 million people. At the beginning, 12 years ago, Turkish people welcomed Syrian refugees and considered them their brothers and sisters, and there was no barbed wire. I remember crossing just walking in the fields, the open field. The Turkish border guard looked at me. I looked at him, didn't do anything, so I just kept walking. People were very welcoming. But a little by little, the Turkish policies have changed, and, inflation soared. Where back in 2011, when the Syrian uprising started, the dollar was worth 1.2 Turkish liras. Today, it's worth 32 Turkish liras. So this economic downturn and the frustration and the inflation has led people to take it out on the Syrians. So every bad thing happened now is because of the Syrians. So in the last couple of years, Syrians were subjected to a lot of different attacks in Ankara a couple of months ago, in Kayseri, and at the Syrian-Turkish borders as well.
Harriet, why do you think Syrians have become such scapegoats in Turkey?
Well, as we were saying, the struggling economy, the Turkish economy has been really dismal in the past year or two. Rampant inflation and unemployment. It might surprise listeners, I think, to know that the number of Syrians that are registered in Turkey, obviously we have estimates that are bigger, as Abdul said, but the number of refugees registered in Turkey is the biggest registered refugee population in the world. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it will surprise listeners to hear that the Syrians have become sort of a lightning rod or a scapegoat for everything else that's going wrong in Turkey, and a kind of used by the far right in Turkey encouraging attacks on Syrian refugees, which it has become something of a widespread problem around Europe, the scapegoating of refugees. But I was surprised as well to learn that the restrictions on Syrian refugees living in Turkey are really, really, really stringent. They don't have refugee status in the way that Europeans might understand it. Like Syrian children often not in schools because they have to stay in the district where they were first registered. So even if they have to move, like after, let's say, like the deadly earthquake last year, they can't then be in a school in the new place where they live, or there's significant controls on entering the job market as well. So things have become increasingly difficult for this massive Syrian refugee population in Turkey. And Erdogan himself, although he has blamed the far-right challengers for kind of stoking this, what he called hatred politics, he himself has overseen the forcible deportation of hundreds of Syrian refugees in the last couple of years. So this is an increasingly tense situation.
Yeah, and what's different about this situation, Arion, is that although maybe Syrians in Turkey have been used to being scapegoated or victimized, whatever word you want to use, this time there have been repercussions for Turks in Syria.
Yeah, the riots in Kayseri seem to have sparked a backlash inside Syria, and video from the town of Atareb, which is currently under the control of Turkish troops in Syria, showed people chanting against the Turkish army's presence and throwing things at an armoured vehicle. There was another video that showed just this really chaotic situation that followed, with plumes of smoke and the sound of gunshots. CNN had a report where they spoke to a local resident who said that smoke grenades had been set off and there'd been shots fired into the air to disperse crowds. And all of this is being caused by, yes, this very violent incident that took place in Turkey directed towards Syrians. But there's another reason for the riots going on in Syria, which has been the separate announcement by Erdogan and the Syrian President al-Assad to restore ties. The discussion is ongoing, but there's serious progress towards this. And tensions have been rising in Syrian opposition-held areas over the moves towards this rapprochement between the two countries, including plans to open a crossing between government-held areas and those held by Turkish-backed opposition forces in Aleppo. Bear in mind, Turkey and its Syrian proxies still control vast swathes of Syrian land in the north, including the Turkish towns of Afrin and Sarikani. And so there is this kind of overlap of Turkish control into Syria already. But I think that there's a lot of people within the Syrian borders who are really concerned about, the sort of the impact of that potential normalization of ties that's being discussed.
Yeah, I mean, Harriet talked about things that sort of surprised her, Abdul. I think a lot of our listeners would be surprised to know that parts of Syria are under Turkish control. It's something that might have escaped people. Just talk us through that.
Well, back in 2016, during the Syrian conflict, Turkey supported armed opposition groups in the country's northwest, aiming to oust Assad from power. The Syrian government has repeatedly condemned Ankara's control over territory, and now they have presence there. So they have a military base there to ensure that the Kurdish armed groups are not in control of these border areas. So that's why Turkey is there. So now Assad wants to make sure that they leave, they go back to the Syrian-Turkish borders, and they use these controlled armed groups in order to fight the Islamists in Idlib, north of Syria.
And what about that normalization process, Abdul? I mean, is that something that, with all of that history, is achievable in the short term? It seems bizarre that Turkey would be backing protest groups and, revolutionaries and people uprising against Assad, and then, 10 years later say, oh, okay, well, we'll just get back into bed with you.
Well, it's all politics, right? Well, look at the Arab League. The Arab League kicked Assad out of the Arab League, and then after 10 years, welcomed it back. Hamas supported the revolution, the uprising against Assad, and then went backtrack and said, no, we support Assad. A lot of countries did that, and Turkey now says we're not opposed to normalizing the situation with Assad. This will make a lot of people in Turkey go back to Syria, and this is very, very worrying because a lot of these people are wanted. A lot of these people do not want to go back. There are a number of people who went back to Syria, got arrested at the airport, and disappeared. We have no idea where they are now. So this is really worrying for a lot of Syrians who live in Turkey.
And as you pointed out earlier, Harriet, some of these people have children. These are families that have moved to Turkey and have been there now for a decade.
I was really surprised based on what we know in terms of polling and what we know in terms of interviews with Syrians. The vast majority do not want to return to Syria, not just because of the threat of forcible conscription or even the threat of being forcibly disappeared, let's say, but also because there's all these rules in Syria that I didn't really understand, where anyone returning to Syria that fled the civil war, they might be liable to pay this really, really large fine. And if they can't pay it, then their property may have been seized. They may come back to find that they no longer have a home. They can no longer work. It's a really big risk to take, especially if you have children that have been growing up in Turkey or wherever they've been growing up for the past 10 years. So it really jeopardizes Turkey's deal with the EU. And I think that's a really important aspect if we want to talk about how this normalization process between Turkey and Syria could potentially impact all our lives here in the UK. That's a really important one, because if Syrians are being forced back into Syria from Turkey, that massively calls into question all the money that the EU has given Turkey to keep them in Turkey, basically, to keep Syrian migrants out of Europe in Turkey. Now, if Syrians in Turkey start thinking that they're going to be forced back to Syria, it massively increases the likelihood that they will instead come to Europe. I know that everyone remembers how bad things were during the migrant crisis in 2000, the height of it in 2015 and 2016. The numbers that came to the UK or came to other European countries were relatively small, but the impact on the discourse, the impact on politics, the impact on anti-immigrant sentiment and political impact as well was huge, and it lingers to this day. So if this deal between the EU and Turkey is going to be jeopardized by this normalization process, that's a massive impact for all our lives. And also the fact that the Assad regime in Syria is still backed by Iran, it's still backed by Russia. This is not a good thing, I think we can say, for the West, for Turkey to be moving closer to Syria.
I think all of exactly what you're saying, Harriet, is why it's so troubling. All of this kind of bringing Syria back into the fold with al-Assad still at the top of it. The Arab League statement, as it readmitted Syria last year, was this kind of emphasis for the need for practical steps towards a gradual solution to the Syrian crisis, in line, they said, with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254, which calls for negotiations on political transition. But critics just are not convinced that al-Assad and his allies will do anything like that. He's just not in a position where he's like, yeah, I'll just roll over and comply with that. And they say that, his supporters, specifically Russia and Iran, just aren't serious about implementing that resolution 2254 because al-Assad believes that launching any sort of political process will lead to his demise and the seizure of power from him. But simultaneously, like, the impact of allowing Syria in without capitulating to any of these demands is really troubling. There was a comment from Mohammed Ghanem, who's the head of policy at the Syrian American Council, and he said this time last year, at that point at which the Arab League was contemplating the readmission, he said, readmitting al-Assad into the Arab League sends a blood-soaked message. You can kill, gas, torture, detain, impoverish, and displace millions of people, commit documented atrocities against women and children, destroy schools and places of worship, and still be welcomed back with open arms. And I think that's the bigger, broader concern here, that the more Syria is normalized with al-Assad at the head, the more other nations will be like, oh, well, we can do similar things. There has to be some sort of consequence for behavior like this.
Yeah. I mean, under all of this, Abdul, are people, your people. How does it feel when you read about this sort of discourse?
Well, it sucks, actually, because when the situation in Kayseri kicked in, I started texting people I know in Turkey, hey, how's it going? How's your sister? How's your brother? How's your family? Everyone is just staying home. If you go on Twitter and social media, you'll see a lot of attacks. Like, people walking just home from work, they get attacked. People on their scooter, they get attacked. And the EU is partially to be blamed in here. In 2016, the EU paid 6 billion euros to Turkey to stop migrants from crossing. And that brought a lot of sentiment against Syrian refugees. A lot of people in Turkey started thinking, oh, Syrian refugees get paid money. And in 2021, EU paid 3 million euros to help Syrian refugees learn language, settle down, and get pocket money. Syrians do not get a penny. My family, my friends, my relatives, none of them gets a penny. There's no social benefit. There's no job center in Turkey. Everyone works.
Where do you think that money went, incidentally?
That's what everybody asked for. The auditors from the EU could not get any data to show where the money has been spent. And Turkey says, we do not have the data for that. And a lot of nationalists who carry these attacks say, hey, you are paid by the EU. They pay you money. Why are you in our country? And that's not true. And that goes on the Turkish authorities. This week alone, the Turkish, until today actually, the Turkish authority have announced that they've arrested 700 people who carried out these attacks in Kayseri and in other cities. So they're doing something to stop these attacks, but we need measures to prevent them from happening in the first place.
Arion, where do you see all of this going next?
Well, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the clip that we played at the top of this segment with Erdogan sounding surprisingly reasonable. But, you'd have to say, Erdogan at various points has pledged to create the conditions, he says, for large numbers of Syrians to voluntarily return to Syria. And in a sort of unfortunate inversion, maybe the kind of violence that we're seeing here is delivering on that pledge, but just in the worst way possible.
Well, I will add a couple of things to what Arion has said. One of them, that we need an elected representative to represent Syrians. We do not have an elected opposition. Our representative were selected by a lot of different countries and founded in Doha in Qatar in 2012. They do not represent the majority of people. None of them has visited anyone in Kayseri. They haven't even been there until now. Number two, which is the most important thing, we need the Turkish authorities to uphold the Turkish law to protect people. As simple as this, not treat Syrians as second-class citizens.
Let's hope so. Still to come, the environmental cost of AI. But up next, are we sleepwalking into another pandemic? That's after this. If you like this podcast, then you're going to love The Week magazine and its daily digital digests. And now is the ideal time to try it out. With analysis and opinion from across the political spectrum, stay informed this summer with The Week. Enjoy 6 weeks free, then save an extra 30% on a print and digital subscription when you enter the offer code SUMMER24 at theweek.com/offer. Start your free trial today at theweek.com/offer with the code SUMMER24. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, scientists studying bird flu have been in a bit of a flap.
You know, COVID taught the world that viruses' genetic code mutates, and flu is a notorious mutator. The risk to people who do not work with cattle and poultry is low today, but mutations in the virus's genetic code could make it better suited to infect people, to spread between people, or could even make it more lethal to people. And those changes would give it pandemic potential that it does not have today. And for all those reasons, we need to be prepared with vaccines and treatments.
Dr. Shira Daron of Tufts Medical Center speaking to WCVB Channel 5 Boston on Tuesday. Arion, pandemic potential. Do we need to start stocking up on bog roll again?
Not just yet, but this week the US government has given the pharmaceutical firm Moderna $176 million to develop an mRNA pandemic influenza vaccine that would work against bird flu. And this investment comes as countries around the world have begun stepping up their bird flu preparations. And it also came as a group of eminent scientists who are tracking the spread of bird flu warned this week that gaps in surveillance could be keeping us several steps behind when it comes to a new potential pandemic. And many of them have been monitoring this new subtype of H5N1 avian flu in migratory birds since 2020. And in a series of interviews that they conducted with Reuters news agency this week, collectively, they warned that the spread of the virus to 135 dairy herds in 12 US states signals this really desperate and dangerous change, though not imminent, in what the illness could represent. And it could...
Because cows aren't birds, simply, right? And so you wouldn't expect cows to get bird flu, but they have. So that means maybe humans are more likely to get it.
First of all, the bird flu has jumped to other mammals previously, but now it's appearing in this massive number of dairy herds across 12 US states around the USA. And, you know, it does bring us closer to the idea of transmissibility between humans. That hasn't happened yet, or so we believe. But one of the scientists who spoke to Reuters this week, a guy called Scott Helmsley, who's a professor of microbiology at the University of Pennsylvania, said it almost feels like there's a pandemic unfolding in slow motion. So while we aren't near bird flu becoming a pandemic just yet, there's a big shift this week going on towards more monitoring and greater preparation in general.
Okay. I mean, Harriet, on the one hand, that sounds like a terrifying news story, given what we've all been through for the last 4 years. On the other hand, I suppose it's a positive story, isn't it? That in response to something like this, we have action, preemptive action. Here you are, we're going to develop a vaccine. We know what to do. So actually, it can't affect us the same as COVID did, can it, if we're better prepared? That's what we've learned.
That's a really good question. And I think probably one, I disagree with you on how well prepared we actually are. The big takeaway here is that scientists were absolutely astonished that this strain jumped to cattle herds. Not just that it spread among cattle herds as quickly as it has, but the fact that it went to cows at all. That we were not prepared for. And also not prepared for the potential fatality rate. We think that the fatality rate in humans is about 53%. That is disputed, but that's what we think. That's what we're working on the basis that the fatality rate would be. Already, it has jumped from the cattle herds to people. A fourth farm worker was infected with it as of yesterday. And the former director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has said that it's not a question of if bird flu becomes a pandemic, but when. So no, I don't think that it's a case of we need to start panicking and stockpiling things. But as a journalist, I do think this story has been going under the radar much more than it should be.
And just to clarify, of the people who have caught bird flu, there's been a few hundred human cases since 1997, so it's not a great number. But, as Harriet's saying, around half of those have died. Now, the reason we're not sure that it is definitely a 50% fatality rate is that people tend to report themselves when they're very, very unwell. That's when it shows up as H5N1. one, and that's when people go, oh, well, one person survived, one person didn't survive. But those people who have only had a sniffle or a cold of some kind that hasn't necessarily forced them to go see a doctor haven't shown up. But even if it's anywhere close to 50%, that's an enormous fatality rate. Even if it's significantly lower than that, it's still potentially problematic.
Well, indeed. And actually, Abdul, even if it didn't transmit to humans at all, if it transmitted amongst all birds and all cows, that would have a massive impact on the world, from a sustainability viewpoint, from an agricultural viewpoint, and, just in terms of food. I mean, that would be a massive problem for us as a species.
Yeah, totally. And the problem is we don't know where this is going. In late 2023 in Peru, more than 5,000 sea lions died with the virus, which scientists say that it caused by animals' direct contact with infected wild birds. And the virus has been, detected in foxes, bears, otters, raccoons, cats, dogs. Here in Hong Kong, the government has asked and warned people not to touch birds because of the possibility of transmitting the disease. So we don't know where it's going, but I think we tend to hype it since we are kind of fresh out of the pandemic a little bit. What are the chances of getting 2 pandemics in a couple of years? I think the chances are very low. So I'm not worried about it at all.
I don't know if the risk is, the UK government thinks the risk of an outbreak among people is somewhere between highly unlikely and unlikely, but that's between 10% and 35%. Now, I don't know about you guys, but those don't sound like very small risk numbers to me. The government's ordered tens of thousands of doses of this bird flu vaccine, right, to boost immunity. Tens of thousands doesn't even put a dent in a population of millions. I think we need to get our head around the fact that this pandemic, it is going to happen. Whether or not the virus mutates into human-to-human spread is unclear, but what we do know is that a bird flu pandemic, it is coming. The problem is that animal and human health agencies are separate, so any problem that happens in the animal or environmental world, the difficulty is linking up human health agencies and animal and environmental agencies to work together. We already saw the problems in the pandemic of agencies not having any kind of good working flow together. All of those underlying systemic issues in the UK are still a problem, even worse than they were since the pandemic. So I'm not telling people at home listening right now to panic, but we do need to pay very close attention.
Also, I suppose it's kind of dangerous to make assumptions based on the COVID-19 pandemic, even if it did become a pandemic, Arion, because it was a bit of an anomaly in that it targeted older people in particular. Obviously, that was still terrifying, but more palatable to the general population than, for example, a pandemic that targeted younger people. We don't know what would happen when this gets let loose on a population.
I think that's right. And as I understand it, flu is a very fast mutating illness. And one of the things that we don't know about the potential for the way that bird flu is going to mutate is whether it will become, less dangerous, whether it will affect the lungs better or worse than the current strain, whether its fatality rate will go up or down. There's a lot that we don't know about it. And I think that's what this group of scientists is attempting to address in making this appeal this week for greater joined up thinking of the kind that Harriet was talking about just then. And, you think about the odds that you were saying, Abdul, of several pandemics coming along hot on the heels of one another. And we did actually have a previous flu outbreak, swine flu, which was H1N1 in 2009. And that virus and its predecessors had been spreading among animals for several years. But, now looking back on it, authorities tend to think that more surveillance would have helped the health authorities prepare better around the world in different parts of the world. And, the number of lab-confirmed deaths reported to the World Health Organization from that outbreak was 18,000. But that's widely considered to be a gross underestimate, and it's believed to have killed actually more in the realms of 280,000 people. So, it feels like something that hasn't happened for a long time. It feels like the 1918 flu is the last time we had a flu outbreak of any significance, but it's not that. It happened in our own lifetimes. And so there's every chance, unfortunately, and I don't want to be a gambling person on this, but there's every chance that it is something that could appear again.
Governments can take all the preparations they want and have all the shots available that they can, although I think it's worth noting that these vaccines, they have to be developed with viruses grown in eggs. It can take like 6 months. So it's not just a case of clicking your fingers and suddenly there's enough shots for everybody. But we do know that anti-vaccine sentiment is massively on the rise in the US especially, but in the UK and Europe as well. We've got measles outbreaks happening in the UK, and so is drinking unpasteurized milk. Like, I don't think we're talking about how much unpasteurized milk has become.
It's a health trend, right? Raw milk in the States.
It's not just a health trend. I think that's where it's really risky. It's not just a health trend. It's also become this sort of calling card of the far right, libertarian, very red state, Trump supporting, F you to the government,
right.
like
Bill Gates poisoning the milk.
Establishment. It's exactly like we're taking back control of our milk fluence, where you might expect. People got bird flu and no one else. Well, it's not hilarious. That's exactly where you might expect anti-vax sentiment to be at its biggest, and lack of trust in the government. True. So I think in terms of what people here can do at home, apart from not drinking unpasteurized milk, please don't do that. The viral load in milk is huge. But what people can also do is educate themselves a bit better about where their meat, and chicken in particular, is coming from, and make sure you know what the stickers on the meat actually means. And if customers show that they're willing to pay a bit more for decently sourced supply chain meat, then that will encourage the suppliers to have better practices in place. So that's one thing that people can do at home as of now.
That is enough potential pandemic paranoia for now. We'll be getting a shot in the arm from Harriet after this.
I'm John Prideaux, US editor at The Economist, and the question I get asked the most is this: why are two old, unpopular men running for president again? The answer lies in the story of Joe Biden and Donald Trump's generation. As the boomers near the end of their political journey, I'm setting out to make sense of their inheritance and their legacy. I'll reveal the mindset of a generation during 6 crucial years. Listen now to Boom from The Economist, wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Will the cloud destroy the Earth?
Artificial intelligence is transforming our approach to environmental sustainability. AI systems are being used to analyze vast amounts of data to predict climate change patterns and optimize energy usage. Smart grids, powered by AI, help distribute energy more efficiently, reducing waste.
Revolutionizing sustainability, AI saving our planet. A video posted by Sustainably Aware on YouTube on Friday. Harriet, I was distracted by the cool lounge music. I wasn't listening. What's the story?
Well, what the clip was talking about is the way that AI can be used to help the environment. What we're going to talk about today is how bad AI actually is for the environment. We're really starting to get a sense of the environmental impact of these new emerging technologies. So what happened this week? Google released its annual environmental report, and it admitted that its greenhouse gas emissions have skyrocketed over the past 5 years, gone up by nearly 50%.
Wow. And so Google as a company across all of its products.
Yeah. And emissions last year in 2023 were 13% higher than in 2022. Google's blaming the electricity consumption at its data centers that powers artificial intelligence, which it's integrated into a lot of its core products, as well as emissions from the supply chain. So this is really putting a spotlight on the environmental impact of this emerging technology, and also how much it's undermining the climate goals of these big tech companies and potentially the green energy transition of the whole world.
Okay, I understand data centers. Obviously, if you have more of them, then you use more electricity. If you use more electricity, then you use more energy, and that's bad for the environment in general. Okay, but AI is different, isn't it, to other computer uses, which I think a lot of us haven't got our head around yet. A search on ChatGPT uses more energy than a search on Google that isn't powered by AI 5 years ago. Why is that?
Yeah, so that's because generative AI, so that's when you use a prompt, like on ChatGPT, for example, to create text or pictures, it uses so much more energy than typical tasks. It's about 33 times more than machines running task software. Not only does AI, and generative AI in particular, actually just cause data centers to have to do so much more work, but because AI is an emerging and very exciting technology for a lot of these tech companies, they're having and trying to build many more data centers. Just to clarify what a data center is, actually, because I think that it's not necessarily that obvious. Data centers are basically where we host servers and store memory. It's kind of the digital backbone of the entire cloud system and computing system around the world. It's physical centers where processing happens and servers are hosted and storage
It's like
happens.
the memory balls in Inside Out.
It's that is exactly and I think it might surprise people to know actually that there's only 7,000 data centers in the world, either built or in production, but that is nearly double the number since 2015, and we need more data centers to build and train and run AI products. So we're talking about exponential power needs and therefore exponential impact on the environment.
Yeah, because Google aren't the only player in this, are they, Abdul? You've got Microsoft, you've got Amazon. This is a problem that's going to affect every tech company.
Yeah, this is a problem that affects all companies that use AI. It's not only Google. Microsoft said its carbon emission had increased 30% since 2020. Again, but this is because of the demand. A lot of people want to use AI. A lot of people always speak that AI is doing positive things, can teach your kids, can do a lot of stuff. So a lot of these companies want to introduce AI. As Harriet said, we did not talk about the impact of this. One of the impacts of using AI, developing AI, is the use of water. AI uses a lot of water. This is something because this is a good question. Why? It's because in order to train these AI data centers, you need to cool them, and a lot of fresh water is used in order to cool them down. So, and the use of water has been phenomenal. So some statistics shows that in 2027, global AI deemed could suck up 4.2 to 6.6 billion cubic meters of water, about half the total water used by the UK every year, and more than all the water used by Denmark in a year.
And some people listening to this, I think, Arion, will just think, well, fine, I won't use AI as much. You know, like it was a fun experiment, and actually I don't need it all the time, and I'll only use it when I need it, and that's fine. But actually, it's companies like Google and Amazon that are investing into AI and iterating their offer to incorporate generative AI in places you don't even know where it is.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, lots of social media users would have seen AI products rolling out across social media by Meta on Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and so on. And even if they don't use them, they're still being trained and developed, and all of that development is using these vast amounts of energy and water that we're discussing. But simultaneously, there are so many products that are dependent on AI, not least the ones in the clip that kicked off this whole segment. You know, Google has said that by 2030, it reckons AI could help mitigate 5 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, Google is going to say that. That's the narrative that they want to build, specifically that its AI research lab, DeepMind, is using AI in the fight against climate change. You know, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates has also downplayed the environmental impact of AI recently, but AI is already helping, and there are AI-powered systems that are processing massive amounts of data quickly, which are being used to inform decisions. You know, AI has already mapped icebergs and measures changes 10,000 times faster than a human can, which helps us understand how much meltwater gets released into the oceans. You know, AI products are being used to map the impact of deforestation using satellite data, which gives an idea of potential potential stored carbon loss. The UN is using it in parts of Africa to help predict weather patterns so communities can adapt. However, all of this is using yet more power, as are the applications for AI that are powering our medical, our educational, our financial, retail, entertainment, and so on. And so even if you're not using the form of generative AI that's been shrunk down and put into the apps that are in your pocket, there's an enormous amount of R&D powering like their development and huge applications by massive multinational corporations that are only going to continue to grow.
Do they have to go hand in hand, those things, though, Harriet? Can't you have, the AI being developed that will help us grow more crops in the future whilst killing off the AI that's analysing your photos on Facebook to work out which emoji to suggest?
Well, no, that's what's really interesting about this, actually, is that you can't. I think what's so interesting about this is it really hammers home all of these kind of nebulous, ephemeral things, the digital, the virtual, cloud computing, AI, internet, they are all underpinned by physical infrastructure in the real world that has real world impact. So these data centers are a huge demand on the electricity grid, for example. So people living near data centers, they see that their electricity prices, like the money in your pocket, it's going up. Your charges are going up because of this increasing, and it's projected to skyrocket over the next few years. I mean, in the UK alone, AI is expected to use 500% more energy over the next decade. So in terms of money in your pocket, you're going to see a hit. And there's also a real geopolitical impact as well. So Malaysia, for example, tech companies are massively investing in Malaysia because Singapore next door, which was a data center hub, has kind of put like a moratorium on new facilities. So there's basically this kind of massive bidding war between these big tech companies ongoing for these data center sites that have power access. And all of this has massive implications for countries' renewable energy goals and climate goals. I mean, we spoke about Microsoft briefly. Microsoft aimed to actually get below net zero by 2030. So that's carbon negative. But actually in May, they said their carbon emissions had increased 30% since 2020, again, because of AI.
Yeah, well, on that, Abdul, I mean, especially with a Trump presidency coming into view more strongly than perhaps it felt 6 months ago, I wonder if some of those American corporations are putting one eye on their green policies and thinking, well, we'll be able to junk those.
Well, not necessarily, because a lot of AI lobbyists or tech lobbyists will argue that AI is good for the environment, other than flirting with you and solving the dating problem of a lot of Chinese people with the AI boyfriend, girlfriend. Other than that, AI has been used in a lot of different places. In the UN, for example, the UN uses it as in parts of Africa to help predict the weather patterns so communities can adapt and prepare. It's also used to map the iceberg and expect how much water is going to melt from these icebergs. So a lot of companies would say, oh, we are using it for good use. So all of this bad
but that's long term, isn't it? Short term is 2030 now. We're not many years away. And what I'm saying is, will they just junk those targets? Is that what's about to happen?
I think, of course, there will be a temptation for companies to engage in environmentally positive behaviors by way of a form of greenwashing rather than because it's something that they actually want to do. So there's always a danger that if they're not being forced to go ahead and make positive changes like the ones that we're discussing, then maybe they'll consider just throwing it all away. But I do think actually there's such a lot of pressures that are forcing positive environmental change, and a lot of those come from within companies as well as externally. It's not just that you have to be seen to be doing things because people who buy your products or who are involved in your supply chain are demanding it. It's because your own employees are not going to work with you anymore unless you actually have a good and positive environmental policy. So I think that actually there's so much pressure building because there are enough people in the world that understand that things have to change, that I don't think necessarily just because we see a change of president in the US, all of this is going to go out the window immediately.
I guess as well, Harriet, just thinking about technology generally, Moore's law, etc., I wonder if optimistically you could say, well, yes, that's a problem now because we're in the very early stages of what is clearly a massive revolution. But, in 30 years' time, when this would have hit a peak, they'd have worked that out. It won't need so much water. It won't need so much processing power. It won't need a surge in electricity.
Well, I don't know if I'm just more cynical than you guys, or if I don't know. We've got to bear in mind that the climate crisis is a crisis, and we don't have 30 years to be sorting this out. Firstly, secondly, Google has already admitted that this massive increase in carbon emissions based on its AI are going to make its target of getting to net zero by 2030 significantly more difficult. In terms of the US, you mentioned as an example, Texas is a good place to watch, being also like a major place where people are investing in data centers. We've already seen in the US the energy demands on the grid are leading to power outages, and there's a really big worry about that. So all of these problems, so in 30 years, things may be one way or another, but we're talking about what is happening now. And what we can see now is that the global battle for supremacy in the AI world is ongoing. And it may be that the winners end up being the people who control the most amount of territory that can be put to this very unenvironmental use. And I think that the potential usefulness of AI that we may or may not know or may not be able to predict has to be weighed against the damage that we do know for a fact that it's already causing. And it is also true and unfortunate to say that the energy needs of AI have massively taken all of big tech by surprise. So with that in mind, no, I think this is a much bigger problem than we might necessarily want to admit.
I've just asked ChatGPT to write me a script to wrap up this episode, and it's come up with the following. That's it for this week's episode of The Week Unwrapped. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Square Brackets host name, and I've been here with Square Brackets co-host 1 and Square Brackets co-host 2. And then you have to say, it's been a great discussion as always. And then the other guest has to say, definitely, lots to think about. And then I have to sign off with, until then, take care and stay informed.
And to produce that, you just took out the whole of Japan's grid.
That's as much water as one Syrian refugee will drink in a year.
Olly, I've asked ChatGPT to write funny jokes about refugees, and he said there's nothing funny about them.
Fair enough. Your whole career is scuppered. Well, listen, I'll do my real script, which is my thanks to Abdul and Arion and Harriet. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.